Hi, everyone. Welcome to this ICLE webinar with Thibault Schrepel and Neil Chilson on decentralization in technology and business. We'll be discussing the new books by Thibault and Neil and having a kind of wide-ranging discussion on a number of topics relating to those themes. I believe that that the Q&A function is operating here. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to submit it through the Q&A mechanism. And if we have time, we'll try to get to those. So let's jump in. Let me first introduce Thibault and Neil. First of all, I'm Jeff Manny. I'm the president of the International Center for Law and Economics. Thibault Schrepel is an associate professor of law at VU Amsterdam University and a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center, where he has created the Computational Antitrust Project. He also teaches and researches at the University of Paris and Sciences Po in Paris. He is a blockchain expert appointed, among other things, to the World Economic Forum. And his latest book, which we'll be talking about today, is Blockchain plus Antitrust, or maybe it's Blockchain and Antitrust, or maybe it's Blockchain et Antitrust, because Thibault is French, was published anyway in September 2021. Neil Chilson is a senior research fellow for technology and innovation at the Charles Koch Institute, where he spearheads the institution's efforts to foster an environment to encourage innovation and individual and societal progress. Prior to joining CKI, Neil was the chief technologist at the Federal Trade Commission, where he focused in particular on economics of privacy and informational injury, and was involved in his several years at the FTC in all of the agency's technology-related activities. Before he was chief technologist, he was an advisor to then acting chair of the FTC, Maureen Olhausen. He practiced telecommunications law at Wilkinson, Barker and Nauer, has a degree in law and also a master's in computer science. And his book, also published this September, is called Getting Out of Control, Emergent Leadership in a Complex World. So we're going to try something a little bit different here. Basically, two extremely insightful, smart, and interesting friends of mine have new books, and I thought it would be fun to talk about them together. Both Thibault and Neil are experts in a number of overlapping fields, antitrust, blockchain, and technology regulation, among others, but their books are on pretty divergent topics, at least nominally. Thibault's book explores the relationship between blockchain and antitrust. I guess that's clear from the title. It focuses in particular on how the two can be mutually reinforcing and where each may expose pitfalls for the other. Thibault's book is often technical and, while wide-ranging, hones in particularly on policy implications. Ultimately, it's a scholarly case study in a uniquely complex intersection of law and technology. Now, I don't think it's a critique of either book to say that Neil's is a much more accessible book. Neil's book is a book about leadership in a complex world. It's a kind of self-help book written from Neil's unique perspective, in which he explains why effective leadership in business and politics, everywhere really, arises where leaders adopt an emergent mindset, eschewing the urge to control and working instead to harness and influence the complex evolving world around them. So why talk about these two books together? I think there are a couple of themes that permeate the books, and I want to tee those up and then hopefully turn to Neil and Thibault to talk about them in more depth. I want to note one kind of important coincidence of interest right at the outset, and that is this, that in Thibault's book, he argues in one place that agencies and regulatory bodies face the challenge of understanding blockchain code and programming. And he advocates for greater comprehension by regulators of the blockchain ecosystem. I think it's very much worth noting that Neil, in 2018, when he was at the FTC, led the way to create an internal blockchain working group at the FTC aimed at building internal expertise and internal and external coordination around blockchain and cryptocurrency issues. So Neil has already been on the ground trying to do what Thibault advocated. And as I said, they both have an interest in and facility with blockchain issues. and antitrust, and the sort of intersection of the two. So I'm sure we will talk about those kind of substantive areas at some length. But I want to start at a much higher level and introduce kind of some common themes in these books that I think will help in our discussion. So the first is, and I think most obviously, that both books deal with the implications of a decentralized world and how best to interact with it. Different contexts, as I said, but decentralization is a central theme in both of the books. Second, I think it's really interesting that both of the books elevate the counterintuitive and ultimately advocate for a fundamental change in mindset among their target audiences. So in that sense, both books are pretty ambitious and have sort of set themselves up for a difficult task. But it'll be interesting to see if there's some commonality in the sense in which they both think people, the target audiences of their books, need to sort of change their mindset. I think related to that, and this isn't a theme that jumps out of Thibault's book, but I think it's very much there, and it does indeed jump out of Neil's book, and that is that they both advocate humility. They both seek to convince readers that this counterintuitive way of thinking often means accepting limitations and getting out of the way rather than asserting control. And I hope that we can talk about that a little bit. And then finally, and again related, both argue for the importance of understanding and regulating or leading complex adaptive systems. In some ways, I want to start there. Undergirding both of these books is the idea that really the world in general, but certainly the areas of focus for the books themselves, are extraordinarily complex. Both Thibault and Neil, I will point out, acknowledge the influence of Hayek in their work and stress that they're dealing with complex systems in which accepting the nature of the system, its complexity, and the limits of knowledge and action within it are crucial to how actors interact in their world. So I'm going to sort of, by way of allowing each of the authors to sort of introduce their books and how they think they relate to some of these themes, I'm going to just sort of start by asking Neil, what does it mean in your mind to say that the world is complex? And what are the implications of the limitations of our knowledge, of our ability to completely understand and control the world around us?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And it's great to be here. Thanks to ICLE for hosting this, and Thibault, great to be on this program with you. So when I say the world is complex, I mean something somewhat pretty specific. I think it's easy to often blend the words complex and complicated, but complexity is a different, it means something different than complicated. A complex system is one that exhibits emergent order. So the concepts of complexity and emergent order are very related. And emergent order, I would say, is the complex behavior of a system that is created by the interactions of many smaller components, following simpler rules with no central control. And I'll just give an example that makes this much more concrete. If you've ever been to a baseball game or a football game or a soccer game, you may have seen the wave. And we can think of the wave as a complex system where there's very simple rules that all the components are following, the individual fans in the stands, about when to stand up and when to sit down. And these are driven by a bunch of different inputs. How is the person near them standing up? Are they enthusiastic about the game? Do they have food in their lap? Lots of different considerations for each individual actor. But the pattern overall that emerges from that simple set of actions is pretty complex, and it's not in anybody's control. And I like to contrast complexity that results in emergent order with designed order, which would be something like the placards at like a college football game where everybody raises them at the same time and it says "Go team." where somebody designed that. That can be a complicated effort, but somebody designed that exactly, and they know exactly what all the pieces are going to do. And then the other thing to contrast that with is just randomness or disorder, which would be something like, the times or the paths that people take in a stadium from the turnstile to their seat, or when they sit in it, where it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. And there's no design there either, but there's no pattern really either. And so when I say that the world is complex, what I mean is that first example, the wave, we have lots of people acting, or lots of elements acting in under simple rules, but the overall system is more than the sum of its parts. That there is something in the interaction between all the parts that creates an irreducible complexity that can't be summarized easily, even though it can be recognized by observers. And the policy implications about that, obviously manyfold, but probably the simplest one is this creates an enormous knowledge problem for the person who would regulate such a system, because the individual inputs to all, because essentially the system cannot be summarized in a way that's less complex than the system itself. So the only way to summarize the system is to have an equation that's as complicated as the system, which means you're going to be leaving out something when you build a mental model of what the system is. And if you can't even build an accurate mental model, the effects on it are going to be unpredictable, because one of the other consequences of complex systems is that even small changes to initial conditions in a model can result in very large differences in outcomes. And that's the distinction between something like a complex system like the weather and a simple system like the swinging of a pendulum, where you can predict. And if you get the measurements off a little bit on a pendulum, you're still going to be relatively accurate about the period of it. Whereas if you get the measurements off a little bit on the state of the atmosphere, very quickly the models become difficult to manage and predict.
That's great. I have a lot of questions to follow up on that, but I think maybe useful for Thibault to give a little bit of an introduction, and to the extent you want, Thibault, I think it'd be great to talk about whether the way Neil characterizes a complex system is similar to how you conceive of it, what the differences might be, and we're going to talk a lot, I think, about kind of regulation, but feel free to nod in that direction as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm delighted to be amongst friends, especially to discuss such important subjects. And, for the last 6 months, people have been asking me, now that you've written a book, what are you working on? And I keep on saying, well, I try to understand complexity. So this is very much at the intersection of my two obsessions for the last couple of years. I very much agree with Neil's definition of it. I think complexity is the science of systems, of how systems react to the context they create. And so you could say that a complex system is complicated, at least it's complicated to understand the complexity of it, because we don't have the right tools, or because we have human brain, and all that. But I very much agree, the two are different. And for that reason, this is something that I use to capture a blockchain ecosystem, because indeed, I think those are complex ecosystems. What you see is that there are different layers within a blockchain. It could get very technical, but basically you do have, of course, the real world in which we live, with the tube going down the ocean from the US to Europe. So we have internet, which is a layer on top of it, and on top of that you have a core software for the blockchain to function, on top of which you have governance and then applications, etc., etc. And so what you see is that in a blockchain ecosystem there is no vertical control. It doesn't mean there is no control at all, but it is not vertical. And if you indeed have horizontal control, it means that then the influence of each element in the system is then very important. It's not enough to just look at the CEO and the shareholders and to try to capture the system that way. It doesn't work. And so what I try to do, and I start the book this way, is to explore who are the people, according to which design do they interact, And if we are then trying to reach a certain objective, and I argue that it should be to maximize decentralization, but it could be any other objective that you want, what I try to show is that it is not enough to just act on one layer of the blockchain, because it may have no impact on the other layers, or most of the time it may have an impact, but it's really hard to measure whether or not decentralizing one layer will actually decentralize the other layers. So to be very specific, some people are saying that a blockchain will be centralized because the mining power, which is the power to validate transactions, will be centralized. And I think it's more complex than that. It is not obvious that if you do have centralization at that layer, it will actually impact the other layers. But sometimes it is also the opposite. And so the question becomes, if you are trying to reach an objective, it is not enough to just go after one specific target. You need to consider the entire ecosystem and see if overall you can actually achieve the objective. So I very much use complexity science in the same meaning, and I think we have no choice but to look at it this way. Otherwise, you will go for type 1, type 2, and type 3 errors. I'm sure it exists. So you would certainly create that.
So, well, all right. Well, let me ask you this: it seems natural to me, as you suggest, that because you don't know how the different pieces will interact, you have to take a more holistic ecosystem sort of approach. But isn't that somewhat at odds with the notion that we can't really comprehend the whole ecosystem? In other words, if you can only approach the blockchain, or Neil, you can address this in other contexts if you like, from a more sort of holistic perspective, or if you're aware that approaching it in a more approachable way will lead to unanticipated consequences, are you really not just trading off one form of problem for another? I mean, how could you possibly understand the whole ecosystem? And if you can't, what benefit do you get by trying to control it as a whole?
I think it might be fair to say that you can never fully understand, the entire dynamism of it, and you can never predict whether or not Bitcoin will be in a certain position in a year from now, or Ethereum, or any other blockchain. But what you can do is first know that when you, let's say, intervene, the consequences of your action may not be necessarily the one that you think they are. So this is, important knowledge. And it might also be that you are trying to measure, the impact of your policy on the entire ecosystem. And of course, you will fail in a sense, because it will never be perfect. But I think you can approach the truth, and even though you have to neglect the existence of certain elements, you could still see that if you decentralize, let's say, the mining power of a blockchain, it has no impact on the willingness to put application on top of it, right? So at least you can understand that by just looking at it from a complexity point of view. And then you may choose, for political reasons to intervene, not to intervene, and that's perfectly fine. But at least I think it gives you a framework to think about the issues, which is actually more accurate. And this is step number 1, right? First, you should spot the issues, and then indeed you may choose or not to do something about it.
So this raises something that gets to an important theme in Neil's book. Neil, you contrast the idea of control with influence, and one thing that I think some people could, in listening to what Thibault just said, if you're a regulator thinking about blockchain, for example, the existence of these sort of unanticipated consequences, and the recommendation that you try to take account of as much as possible the sort of unintended consequences of your limited interventions, it might actually ironically be a call to try to control the system, right? Let's constrain it as much as possible right out of the gate, so that we don't have to deal with all of these unanticipated problems. Let's, rather than adjust our regulation to the system, let's adjust the system to our regulatory apparatus. And that strikes me as being well, it gets to the counterintuitive point. That I think that's probably not a counterintuitive sort of approach, and I think it ties nicely with your notions of the difference between control and influence.
Yeah, the classic example of this is in James C. Scott's book "Seeing Like a State," around German forestry, where the same sort of
classic example. Everyone talks about German forestry.
German forestry, yeah. So they just started out by trying to understand the forest, right? But from a very specific lens, one of lumber production, right? So they just wanted to measure the forest to see how much lumber they were getting out. But that drove then reshaping the forest to be more measurable and for lumber. And that drove basically planting trees that produced the most lumber. And eventually it resulted in a very aesthetically pleasing rows of all the same trees that in the short term really ramped up lumber production. But in the long term, it was a monocropped forest, which not only in the end stopped producing as much lumber because of disease, but also destroyed many of the other uses that the forest had to many other users other than the government. And so it's not that control is always impossible. Often it is, and you'll try to exert control and it just won't work. But often, if you do gain control over the one particular dimension that you're interested in, or the set of dimensions that you're interested in, you destroy the complexity of the system and turn it from a complex system into a simple one that is possible to control. So you solve the knowledge problem by basically making the system less complex, less robust, less able to satisfy many needs, and you turn it into a simple system that may satisfy the one need that you have, but in the German forestry example, in the long term, may not even really satisfy that. And I think that's the concern that I have with exercising control in a complex system.
Jeff, may I react to that? Because I think it ties with blockchain perfectly. In a complex system, if you take one element out of the system, then you're not facing the same system anymore. The identity is entirely different. So indeed, you could say I'm going to control the forest. And the way by which I'm going to do that is that I'm going to eliminate all the trees. And then the system is less complex, but this is not a forest anymore. And I think the same is exactly true for blockchain. If you say, well, you know what, distribution, decentralization, pseudonymity, all that is too complex, I can't control, one explains the other, I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm going to put in a pilot in a cockpit of a blockchain. Yes, then it's much easier to control, but you are not facing a blockchain anymore. And all the good that is coming out of a forest or out of a blockchain is then gone at the same time. So controls come with the, also these drawbacks of eliminating all of the positive features of complexity.
Absolutely, 100%. That's terrific.
Yeah, totally. It's great. But your the example you've been using in this, I want to come back to the idea of layers here, which it seems to me that part of the reality of a layered complex system, and maybe every complex system has these sorts of layers, is that some layers are more, well, they have a lot of different characteristics, more controllable than others, more understandable, and may or may not have as much interaction with other layers. So you take the example you gave of I don't know, sort of, I think you implicitly said this, like somehow you could mandate decentralized mining, right? If there's a concern that cryptocurrency mining would become heavily centralized, in theory, let's say you could effectively decentralize the mining piece. And you pointed out that that won't necessarily change the extent of centralization or the way on which applications are riding on the blockchain rails. So one consequence of that, to me, would be, okay, that may be true, but that means also you're going to do a lot less harm to the rest of the system if by controlling that one piece of it, you're not necessarily destroying other complex aspects of it. Is that a fair characterization? Is it true to say that that kind of that there are those differences between layers or maybe other kinds of elements of a complex system? And does that mean there are parts of these systems that we should be trying to focus on because we'll do less damage, let's say, if we get it wrong? I obviously that was sort of for Thibault in particular, but Neil, I'd love to hear you weigh in on
Sure.
that.
I think it is fair to say, I never heard a blockchain developer saying, well, I'm not going to develop something on top of the Ethereum because the mining power is too concentrated. I think it could be if just one person was, validating all the transactions, then you could say, okay, now it is reaching a point of centralization for that particular layer that will actually impact the others. But otherwise, this is a mild correlation between the two. I think, on the contrary, if you were to say, well, the governance of a blockchain is just clearly in the hand of just one person, and that person can get rid of transactions, take the money away from your wallet, then you're not talking about a blockchain anymore. And there, it will create an incentive not to develop something on top of a blockchain, but just to develop it on top of Windows or Mac, right? Whereas the software developer, Apple or any other company could say tomorrow, this is not working anymore on my system. So there are indeed differences in the importance of layers. And it means that this is valuable information, one, because you know that if you try to reach a certain objective, there are layers for which it's not even worth trying centralizing or decentralizing because it has no impact. And so it may also mean that, of course, if you do a mistake there, as Nassim Taleb was saying, decentralization loves mistake because indeed it has no impact. So, it's great, but it also means that you can't even reach your objective in the first place. So potentially you do want to act on the important layers, but I think you may want to do it in a certain way and experiment instead of just imposing control. But that's something for the discussion later on.
Yeah.
Is this idea of layers generalizable, do you think, Neil? Is that, I know it's a way that we talk about blockchain and some other technological systems. Is it generalizable to your approach?
So in complexity theory, you talk about boundaries, signals, and hierarchies. And so complex systems all have sub-elements, and those sub-elements are split up from each other by boundaries. And that means they can be placed in hierarchies. And so a simple example is, I have cells in my body that are different, that are separate from other cells, but they're within organs, and then the organs are obviously within my body. So there's a hierarchy there, and there's signals that cross those boundaries. The big challenge is in a complex system is that we are sort of describing what those are. It's a descriptive thing. When I just said what I said about like my organs and myself and my body, it's descriptive. I'm seeing boundaries. I'm using my mental power to identify those. The problem is that there may be connections that I don't fully understand, because when I do that, what I'm saying is I'm abstracting away the details that are happening inside, my stomach. And I'm just going to call it the stomach. It has these inputs, it has these outputs. I'm abstracting away what happens in there. And if I miss some of the signals or how it connects to the rest, if that's a false boundary that I've created, I could really mess something up. And so I think that's true in regulatory spaces as well. We talk about software layers, but often those layers they're sort of a mental model that we have for software, much more so than they really fundamentally describe what is happening. There can be signals that cross those boundaries in ways that are very complicated, and so if we rely too much on that abstraction, we could really mess up the system.
It strikes me as a little bit of a problem even. Thibault relies a lot on talking about in particular, say the governance layer as opposed to the applications layer, the physical layer in blockchain. But do you think, Thibault, maybe there's a risk in that kind of simplification, not least of which is somebody out there is going to say, I'm really worried about that governance layer. I'm gonna tackle what's going on there. By someone, I mean a regulator. And they their mental model may be too much of a separation, so they think they can do that without too much harm, and yet you would understand that it's really just an abstraction.
So I would say, yes, there is a risk if they only read the first 4 chapters of my book. Otherwise, I do explore, it's going to sound like we have scripted the entire conversation because it is very fluid. Because, to go back to the stomach story. We have a lot of those in antitrust. Those are firms, right? We just say, oh, there is a firm here, a firm here, and a firm here, and we don't, consider really the differences between those. And I think that if you apply the same for blockchain, it's even worse, because again, there is not even the centralized zone of control. And so you can't, it really means that you need to understand all the elements in the system. And I understand this is way more complicated because it is more complex, right? To say what's the influence of the miner, what is the core developer, what is the design behind it, what can they do or not? Way more complex and complicated that I think we have no choice but to understand that. So I do, this is what I call the granularity approach in the book. I do think we need to understand each single element in the system. This will be great for firms, but this is even more necessary when it comes to blockchain.
Neil, do you want to
Yeah.
respond there?
Yeah. I mean, and maybe we were going to get into this later, but I'm happy to jump into it right now.
Yeah.
It is really interesting.
Go wherever you guys want.
It's really interesting to think about the why we have firms and the boundaries between them and the potential impact of something like blockchain on that. And so, firms are essentially a result of transaction costs. And so where it's easier to do transactions in a more of a command and control, although in my book, I dig into the fact that just like within our body, there's lots of hierarchies. Anybody who's worked at an organization of any kind knows that command and control is not really how organizations work. It's still a lot of persuasion, norms, habits across the organization. It's culture, a lot of things that are not just orders from the top and executing them. But it's not market transactions that are arm's length, and so that's why we have firms. But when you reduce the transaction costs to do those types of arm's length transactions, you can split things out. You can firms can be much smaller and still accomplish the big tasks that they're trying to accomplish because they split up the task among many different organizations, and they have market mechanisms between them. And blockchain offers a bunch of this, right down to having completely decentralized organizations where you don't need a hierarchy the same way, and where you can build consensus about what the organization or the institution does without having a sort of command structure. And that's really interesting. Just in and of itself, it's a really interesting economic question, but I think it has huge implications for antitrust and how we think about the firm or industry when we have organizations that can appear and disappear very fluidly in order to accomplish a single goal often. I would love to hear what Thibault thinks.
Thibault has a great discussion in his book about exactly that. Thibault, do you want to?
Sure.
So in particular, I'm thinking of the kind of what blockchain does to our sort of theory of the firm and our conception of antitrust, which is kind of built on a foundation of the theory of the firm.
Sure. So we do have. I mean, the case law is pretty consistent here. Since Ronald Koh's paper, we've been designing the firm pretty much the same way. And this idea that, potentially there are routines and habits and, all that is pretty much gone. So for the purpose of antitrust, you would say, I do not even care about the legal entities, the legal statutes, if one controls the other, because 100% of the shares or because they could determine the prices and all that, they are deemed to be the same firm, which again is very much this idea of verticality, which is gone when it comes to blockchain. So I think if you are facing Bitcoin or Ethereum, you can't even say that that's a firm. It doesn't mean anything, right? This is all fluid. And I think this is why we have to understand indeed how those systems and ecosystems will emerge and evolve, which requires to study certain specific elements, which are not the ones that, we use to define what is a firm once again. And indeed, I think, some transaction costs will go down with blockchain. Some others will potentially also go up. And this is why I see that there is room for the big tech and the other firms and for blockchain. I'm not convinced that blockchain will take over the entire centralized world. And I'm not convinced that the other firms can do the same. I mean, for me, Facebook saying in the video that they're going to use NFTs in the metaverse is pretty much the company telling us that they are, they surrender. they can't even fight about the NFT, so they're going to try to capture the value differently, but there is still someone behind the NFT who actually captured the entire value of the transaction. So there is room for blockchain and big tech in my view, and for that reason, I think this is going to be fascinating. Twitter just announced this week that they are moving toward full decentralization, which is the first time a big tech is transforming toward this kind of organization. But something I do want to say is that the number one reason why people are not using Facebook, according to surveys, because they do not trust Mark Zuckerberg, right? This is not because Facebook hasn't cool feeders or any of those things. And this is where you see that having a clear pilot in the cockpit could be a danger, but it could also be that the pilot is Steve Jobs, in which case this is great, right? Because you could put a product even before the consumers realize they want the product, which is something that is not possible for blockchain, because the pilot is actually all the passengers. And so for that reason, I think we have room for blockchain and big tech. And for that reason, again, we need to capture what is a blockchain for the purpose of antitrust if we want to apply the law to it, because otherwise the legal fiction of the firm is gone and you can't even think about antitrust issues. It doesn't mean anything anymore in decentralized ecosystem.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I have lots of questions.
Totally.
In fact, as you said, we could have a whole seminar on it.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's such a difference between centralized organizations and decentralized organizations, or more, I should say, more centralized and more decentralized. I think that's a more accurate way to say it. Kevin Kelly has a great book called Out of Control that talks a lot about emergent systems in nature. And one of his big points is that many of the benefits of highly decentralized organizations, around robustness and flexibility and adaptability and durability, are a result of, in many ways, highly inefficient systems, right? They're extremely redundant, so that they can lose giant chunks of the system and it still works often. So when you think of a beehive or an anthill, these are great examples where they can lose hundreds and hundreds of the individual components and still operate fine. Whereas you pull out a single piece of metal out of your car engine and the whole thing grinds to a halt. But that comes at the cost of it's not particularly efficient, or it doesn't look efficient when we think about it in comparing it to a machine. And so I think the types of organizations that we'll have in the future are largely driven by what do we want more of? Do we want more robustness, flexibility, ability of lots of people to participate? Or do we want more economic efficiency, faster ability to build sort of a brand, or build a brand around a single individual like Steve Jobs? There's benefits to those. And so I really do think that there will be room for both. And it'll be interesting to see how they interact, including potentially how one of the advantages, and I'll put that in air quotes, one of the advantages that a centralized organization might have over a decentralized organization is the ability to come up with an approach that would weaponize, say, antitrust law or shift antitrust law against disruptive competitors. And because of some of the collective action problems, which blockchain may help solve, but because of those, you could see lobbying and cronyism that favors current organizational styles over future disruptive organizational styles. And I think we should keep an eye out for that.
I'd love to, can we think of an example of where a firm has formed to solve to solve a transaction cost problem or other problem, but only because the blockchain or some decentralized form of organization wasn't technologically available. So the firm is solving a perceived problem, but not the best way to solve it. But it turns out, but blockchain actually could theoretically solve it better. So in other words, where are the areas where we see firms or other forms of centralization or hierarchy happening today, where we think it's obvious or most likely that something like blockchain provides a better way of doing that everyone understood from the beginning. Look, a firm is better than just doing this in a pure market setting. But it turns out if something like a blockchain or a smart contract in particular, I'm thinking of, that might facilitate that, it would actually be better. You must have some examples of that, Thibault.
Is it for me? Yeah. I mean, I think most people would say DeFi, decentralized finance. I much rather have the money in an account or a wallet that I only control instead of a bank. But the first example that came to my mind is actually music streaming. I think it is more efficient in a sense, especially for the artists. I mean, it depends, of course, efficiency for whom, but for the artists, I could see how it is more efficient to put a music out there, set up a smart contract, and say that every time you're going to listen to the music automatically by way of smart contract, you're going to send a tiny fraction of a token to the artist, and it works. I mean, those platforms are emerging as we speak. They grow, and of course, if you are a big star, you will make a lot of money out of Spotify and Pandora and all those. But for most of my friends playing in bands with just 3,000 or 4,000 listens every month, they would do $1-2 maybe. So I would say this is probably more efficient for them to do it through those decentralized platforms. Again, I mean, decentralization is hard, especially prediction is hard, especially when it's about the future. So maybe this is a bad example, but this is where, yeah.
Well, I think it's a good example, in at least insofar as I had a similar thought years ago when we first started talking about blockchain. The very first thing that came to mind to me was sort of an alternative to a copyright system in terms of at least online interactions, and especially streaming. And in fact, I'm kind of surprised isn't the right word, but maybe disappointed that was obvious sort of from the beginning, and we still don't have it. We also don't have flying cars, right? So, I mean, there is lots of questions we could explore about what you need to have. I assume part of the reason is not because the technology isn't there, but because other things need to happen as well. And it goes in part to this idea of difficulty in designing a system, in designing order at that large scale. You could design, and you could provide the technology for some piece of it, but for that to work in a global sense, there are a lot of pieces that have to come together that certainly blockchain per se isn't going to facilitate, which also gives rise to this idea that there is reason to think the two would coexist. You still and this goes partial answer to my prior question. There are still things I think that are going to be done better through some kind of hierarchical top-down control. Blockchain doesn't do away with that. It just provides, it does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is provide alternatives for some situations where top-down control isn't necessarily the best.
May I say something? And then I'll give you back the floor, Neil. But something. So first, flying cars. I was listening to Elon Musk, and he says that in 2 years we're going to have those. It's ready, apparently. The tech is ready. And the same is true for blockchain. I mean, if you want to set up a smart contract and automate payments, the tech is ready. But something which is central, especially in complex ecosystem, including blockchain, is actually the norm or the social willingness to adopt the system. And this is such an important ingredient in the system, because the number one reason I think why people are not using those decentralized platforms for music is because they are not aware of it. Every time I have a discussion with a musician about it, they say to me, please send the link, I'll put the music out there. And so this social acceptation is actually central. And this is something which is fascinating when it comes to blockchain, because of course you have all the technical aspects, but again, because there is no clear power of command and control, it means that you can't impose decision on others. So if you design a blockchain, even though you might be the developer, you can't impose updates for the core software, meaning that you need to convince the people. And this is exactly what we saw with the Ethereum, in which they had the tech ready to move for a different from one consensus to another one, and they needed 2 years to explain to the people why this would be good for them, why they should not be worried about it. And this social element, I think, is central. I'm more than curious to hear from Neil about it.
Yeah, that's I think that's fascinating. I love the it's so in line with the themes of my book, to say not only is blockchain itself as the technology, pushes decentralization, but its adoption, just like any other technology, relies heavily, actually probably to your point, much more so, because everybody gets a vote, not just in buying the product. We all vote to buy iPhones or Android phones and give our money. We vote with our dollars, but you're also voting for what the product looks like often, and by that token, it means a slower but a more sort of inclusive often process. And it does mean that there are probably certain things that this is not well suited for, but in many ways it's a more, this gets to a question we haven't asked yet, but the power of decentralization here is that it lets people try something and try something new without having persuaded that many people. And then because they have that toehold, they can try to persuade. Whereas in many of our systems, especially ones that have precautionary regulatory regimes, you have to convince the regulator first that it's even a good idea to try. And blockchain right now operates in a much more permissionless scope, where you can try something out new, fork the software, create a new platform, a new set of tokens, and then see what happens, see if it works in the marketplace, without having to really even seek anybody in particular's permission to do that. And that's going to lead to a lot of failures, but it allows for the potential of new successes that are disruptive to the old business models. And I think that's one of the reasons that I see a lot of potential in the space for solving problems that are complicated and complex.
Regarding the failures, there are websites where you can see all the existing blockchains. Last time I checked, there are over 6,000 blockchain in existence. And of course, if you go back to the website just even 1 or 2 hours after, you will see that the list is actually totally different, because some have disappeared, new ones have appeared in the meantime. But I do have to remember to use the sentence buy that token more often when discussing blockchain. So I will steal that from you. This is a good one.
I didn't even catch that. Yeah, okay. So one thing that makes me think of, though, going back to your norm point, and I assume this, and it's not just norms. I think there are probably areas with a very decentralized system like blockchain. Kind of ironically, I assume there are a number of areas that could benefit from perhaps even greater coordination and arguably control than you might need elsewhere. And maybe that presents kind of unique antitrust risks. Again, ironic, because you have this hugely decentralized system, but if the problem is, you need to have enough uptake, or you need to inculcate the right norms, or you frankly just need enough people to have the right software or hardware on their devices to be able to interact, you could see a role for a very valuable role, one that on net would be hugely positive for some real sort of coordination and centralization. And you could also see this, getting back to our very beginning point, and you could also see regulators being very skeptical of that, maybe because they're not looking holistically, because they're looking at this one activity that might be sort of seem to be a problematic form of centralization. Is that, Thibault, you have raised sort of analogous issues in your book, but Neil, sounds like you want to weigh.
Yeah, so I'd really like to make a distinction between coordination and control. I think those are very different concepts. And coordination, one of the things that blockchain is good at is building consensus. It's a mechanism for everybody agreeing on how they're going to apply a certain algorithm, right? And what the algorithm is going to look like. And that is decentralized and not under anybody's control. And so, but it is a mechanism for coordination. And so if there are problems we need to solve through coordination, I don't see that as an area where necessarily we need more centralization, because that is the promise. That's the very promise of the technology. Now, is it the best way to coordinate? Maybe it is in some circumstances and not in others, but I don't think that that's the same thing as control. necessarily.
Of course, antitrust is also skeptical of coordination, of course, even when it's not control. But your point is well taken. It seems to me that I don't know, Thibault, if you want to talk a little bit about examples of where there are kind of pitfalls in the interaction of antitrust and blockchain, but it seems plausible to me to think that one area where this might come to the fore, Neil, and Thibault, is at the interaction of blockchain and the real world, where there are lots of elements of the real world that are very lumpy, right? Some might say, some regulatory agencies think, for example, that there's a single provider of mobile devices in the Apple mobile devices market, but let's just say there are two. Really, there's two operating systems. So the interaction between various applications running on blockchain and the literal devices that people have in their hand, you could see a real kind of funnel there, and you could see activities occurring there that might raise some skepticism, raise the eyebrows of some regulators. I don't know if you'd call it control. I mean, I don't know if it's control or coordination, but I don't know. Thibault, is that a particular area of concern, that the interaction between blockchain and the real world, or are there others that are worth highlighting as raising these kinds of conundrums?
So first, I know that you are arguing that blockchain isn't real because you said blockchain in the real world.
You use that in your book. You talk about the real. Maybe I have the phrase.
I was
wrong,
about to
you
say.
Literally talk about a layer.
I know. I was about to say. I was about to say it. The real space.
Real
but
space,
I always use the real space. But so I said that prediction was hard, and this is where I was already wrong. In just a few years of doing research in the space, I thought that the first cases will concern how blockchain could actually impact the real space. And in fact, this is not the case at all. All the cases that we have, mainly in the US, are about how you see antitrust infringements within blockchain ecosystems. I'm more than happy to discuss all that, but I thought that indeed, it is so obvious to me that if you want to collude regarding the price of beverages in your supermarket, you may want to use a smart contract so you can actually automate the entire cartel and punish deviations and prevent deviation for that reason in the first place, and therefore have a stronger cartel. That companies will do that, and I think I'm aware of a few companies actually doing that from a discussion I had with people in the space, but this is not what happened so far. The cases that we have are very technical in nature. They concern forks seen as being anti-competitive, or we have one ongoing case with one particular blockchain in which they said the value of the token was fully backed with the US dollar, when in fact it wasn't true. And so they were able to use those tokens to buy Bitcoin at a cheap value. So I think still you might be right, and I hope my initial prediction was right, that the impact of blockchain on the real space will be at the very center of our concerns. But if so, I want to insist on the fact that it may also bring a lot of positive things to market.
That was my point.
Right?
Sure.
Indeed. And so when you address the issues, I think you should do it in a way to preserve the technology. And to preserve the tech, I think you have no choice but to ensure that it retains elements that will differentiate the tech from centralized ecosystems. Because if not, I see no reason why people will use a centralized blockchain instead of just using a regular firm. And so there are ways, and I try to suggest how to do that in the book, to address the issues while preserving decentralization, which I believe is central here.
Neil, I don't know if you're welcome to weigh in on that in particular, but I have a sort of related question for you.
Yeah, fire away. I think he captured it all.
Yeah. So, are there examples that you can think of where, how to put this, sort of technological or other changes have happened before it doesn't have to be regulators, but that's the context in we usually think about it. But business leaders or other actors sort of catch up. And I don't know. I'm kind of curious about what happens at that disruption point, right? Part of the system, complex adaptive system evolving, is that you have those sort of disruptions. There's nothing unnatural or inherently problematic about, but from I think you said this before, from a sort of localized maximum point, there is a real problem. And I think some ways that a lot of what Thibault is talking about here is the risk that those kind of perceived transition problems could end up swamping the whole system, because it's like the leading edge. That's what we see, and that's what we're worried about, and we're sort of missing the forest for the trees. There must be good examples in your mind of where that's happened before and how we can try to avoid that problem.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the techno panic problem is old and long, and and it's basically every technology from the Walkman to the pencil to the teddy bear to writing faced these challenges where people saw downside risk and therefore were arguing against having the technology at all. But let me offer a more optimistic view. One of the biggest impacts that I would say, like the industrial age had, was that it built a mental model for how we solve problems, right? And that mental model got imported into government. And so you had this high modernism approach that basically said, society is a machine that we can design and we can turn on and turn off, and it'll execute according to our plan. And that, social engineering came out of that, and lots of terrible things, because that metaphor doesn't fit very well with the complex emergent order that is human society. My hope is that the blockchain technology, Web3, that these technologies give regulators a new metaphor, that they become familiar with these technologies, and as a result, they have a more realistic view of what human society is like and what role that regulation and government can play in that. What is the proper role? And I hope for a era of maybe high decentralization. Maybe that's a total bastardization of James C. Scott's term, but where the mental model that regulators and politicians have is one of emergent order rather than a mechanical machine for society and the economy. Maybe that's just my wishful thinking, but I hope we get there.
You're optimistic about that?
I'm optimistic to the extent I'm optimistic, it's because I think just like when regulators saw the giant success of the sort of engineering mindset in the industrial age, they saw how well that worked. That if we have blockchain technology that works well, that will be proof positive at solving complex problems. That will be proof positive, and people will look to that as a metaphor.
That assumes they want to solve the complex problems and they don't just want more control. One of the nice things about the modernization process you're talking about is that it happened also to coincide with the desire to control everything. This might undermine that, but I think it would be great. I totally agree. And I wonder, we're sort of close to the end, so maybe there's optimism specifically with respect to blockchain and the way it's been approached. Do you see any places, Thibault, where, I don't know, regulators are kind of getting it right, or being appropriately humble, or sort of reasons for optimism?
Yeah, somehow it disappears, but I'm back. I was in cyberspace. Most agencies I'm in touch with are interested in learning from a technical angle what is blockchain, which is not what I see with AI, where everybody thinks to believe that they know AI and understand it very well. But in fact, I see some kind of fear when it comes to blockchain. And I think this is great. So I'm also optimistic in that regard. And something that I want to mention is that what might be a solution, and I realize this is something for a far distant future, but might be to use blockchain within the sphere of public institutions to decentralize a little bit. And the reason why they may want to do that, and I explore in chapter 14 of the book why they may want to do that, is because I believe they will be more efficient. And if indeed they care about control and making sure to capture more of the control, somehow I think decentralization may help reaching better public decisions. And it might be a good reason why they may be tempted to do that. And I explore how they could do that, on their own in private without even telling us, using prediction market and future key on top of blockchain to try to see if they could come up with better solutions when it comes to merger control and designing policy. So I'm also positive. We'll see if it happens. I have no idea, but I will try my best. And thank you very much for the wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I really enjoyed it. I will just add one thing to what Thibault just said. This sort of is my point about both of you advocating for a kind of counterintuitive approach and the need to change mindsets. And I think it's a difficult challenge both of you have set for yourselves. But both of your books are sort of wonderful forays into this area. Everyone would profit from reading both of them, but regulators in particular would learn an enormous amount. And I won't be optimistic, but I will be hopeful that this sort of change in mindset is something that you guys can help bring about. So I want to thank you so much for having this discussion. Thank you for writing these great books.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Okay, thanks, guys. I think that's it. So
bye-bye.
Thanks all for attending. We appreciate it.